At about 9:45 on the morning of September 13th, 1971, a National Guard helicopter came in low over a prison yard in western New York and dropped a cloud of gas onto more than 1,000 men. The gas was CS, a riot agent that burns the eyes shut and takes the air out of a man's lungs. In the yard below, the prisoners went down. They could not see. They could not stand. 40 guards and prison employees who had been held hostage in that yard for 4 days went down with them because the gas does not know who is who. And then a voice came over a loudspeaker. The recording of it still exists. The voice said, "Surrender peacefully. You will not be harmed." Then the shooting started. For roughly 6 minutes, several hundred New York State police troopers and correction officers fired more than 2,000 rounds into that yard. They fired shotguns loaded with buckshot, which does not send one bullet at one man, but throws a spray of heavy pellets that ricochet off concrete and steel. They fired rifles loaded with soft-point bullets, a kind of ammunition that international convention had already banned from use in warfare. They fired into a yard where more than 1,000 blinded men were lying on the ground, and where 40 hostages were lying on the ground with them. When the smoke cleared, 39 men were dead or dying. 29 of them were prisoners. 10 of them were the hostages the state had come to rescue. And by that afternoon, officials were telling reporters something that went around the world within hours. They said the hostages had been found with their throats cut by the prisoners. It was on the front page of every newspaper in America the next morning. It was not true. Not one word of it. The next day, a county medical examiner named Dr. John Edlund finished the autopsies and reported that every single one of the dead hostages had died of gunshot wounds. The prisoners in that yard had no guns. The only guns fired that morning belonged to the state of New York. This is the story of Attica, a prison that opened to newspaper headlines calling it a paradise for convicts, and that 40 years later produced what a state commission would call the bloodiest encounter between Americans since the Civil War. It is the story of 4 days in September, of a broken gate that nobody knew was broken, of 1,000 men who tried to negotiate, and of the 6 minutes that ended it. If you are new here, this is what we do. We tell the stories of the forgotten institutions of America, the asylums, the reformatories, the prisons on the edge of the map, the places the country built and then tried very hard not to look at. If that is your kind of thing, the subscribe button is right there, and it genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now let's go back to the beginning, to a prison that was supposed to be the most modern in the world. Attica Correctional Facility opened in June of 1931 in a small farming village in Wyoming County in rural western New York, about 40 miles east of Buffalo. It was built as an answer. In 1929, New York's prisons at Auburn and Clinton had erupted in riots, and the state decided it needed something better, something modern, something that could not be broken out of and could not be broken open from the inside. So it spent about $9 million, an enormous sum at the time, making Attica the most expensive prison ever built in America. And the press loved it. When it opened, newspapers described it in glowing terms. It was called architecturally handsome. And most famously, one description that would follow this place forever. It was called a paradise for convicts. The wall alone tells you what they were thinking. It ran roughly 30 feet high and 2 feet thick, ringed with more than a dozen gun towers, and much of its mass ran below the ground as well, so that no man could dig his way under it. The prison was designed to hold around 1,600 men in individual cells, in 4 great cell blocks laid out around a central hub. The blocks were called A, B, C, and D, and here you need to remember one piece of geography, because everything that happens in this story happens because of it. The 4 corridors connecting those 4 cell blocks all met at one junction in the middle of the prison, controlled by heavy steel gates. The men inside had a name for that junction. They called it Times Square. Whoever held Times Square could move between all 4 blocks of Attica. It was the single most important door in the building. 40 years later, in September of 1971, the paradise looked very different. The prison held about 2,240 men in a building designed for 1,600. They were locked in cells 6 feet by 9 feet for 14 to 16 hours a day. And the conditions had become the kind of grinding, daily humiliation that people on the outside almost never hear about because they sound too small to matter. Each man was issued 1 roll of toilet paper a month. 1. He was permitted 1 shower a week. He was allowed 1 bucket of water to wash himself and his clothes. Mail was censored. Reading material was restricted. Medical care was minimal. Men worked prison jobs for as little as 6 cents a day, and out of that, they were expected to buy their own soap and stamps. And then, there was the thing that sat underneath all of it. About 2 out of every 3 men inside Attica were black or Puerto Rican. Most of them from New York City, from Buffalo, from Rochester. Of the several hundred correction officers who guarded them, recruited almost entirely from the white farming counties around the prison, not one was black. There was, at the time, only 1 Latino officer on the entire staff. Many of the Spanish-speaking prisoners could not make themselves understood to the men who controlled every hour of their lives. Try to actually live inside those numbers for a moment, because that is where the anger came from. 1 roll of toilet paper is about 500 sheets. Divide that by 30 days. That is what the state of New York had decided a grown man required. 1 shower a week means that for 6 days out of every 7 in the summer, in a building with no air conditioning and almost no ventilation, in a cell 6 feet by 9, a man simply smelled. The bucket he was given to wash in was the same bucket he washed his clothes in. The food was starch and grease, served cold. Men who worked in the metal shop for 6 cents a day would spend a week's wages on a bar of soap. A letter from a man's mother could be opened, read by a stranger, and thrown away without explanation, and he would never know it had come. If he got sick, he put in a request, and the request might be answered in a week, or might not be answered at all. If he was Puerto Rican and spoke no English, he could not explain to anyone what was wrong with him. None of that is dramatic. That is exactly the point. There was no single atrocity at Attica in the summer of 1971. There was just the daily, grinding, deliberate smallness of it, applied to 2,000 men, year after year, by an institution that had decided they were not entitled to anything more. Now, put that in the year. It was 1971. Outside the walls, America was in the middle of the most turbulent decade in its modern history. Inside them, the men were reading. They were reading about civil rights, about black power, about the young lords, about prisoners' rights. In July of 1971, a group of them sent the state a manifesto, a list of demands, written in careful language, asking for better food, better medical care, an end to censorship, religious freedom, and a living wage for their labor. The state's response was slow and thin. And then, in August of 1971, came the news that lit the fuse. At San Quentin, in California, a prisoner named George Jackson, a famous and widely read figure in the prison movement, was shot and killed by guards. When the word reached Attica, hundreds of men went to breakfast the next morning and refused to eat. They sat in silence. Many wore black armbands. It was the most disciplined thing the administration had ever seen from the yard, and it frightened them more than a riot would have, because it meant that the men in Attica were no longer a crowd. They were organized. 3 weeks later, everything came apart, and it came apart by accident. Nobody planned the Attica Uprising. That is the first thing to understand, and it is one of the best documented facts in the entire story. It began with a small, ordinary prison incident. On the 8th of September, there was an altercation in one of the yards involving 2 prisoners. A lieutenant intervened. Later, one of those men was removed from his cell in a way that other prisoners believed, rightly or wrongly, meant he was being taken away to be beaten. Word of it went through the cell blocks, overnight, the way word always does in a prison, growing as it went. The next morning, The 9th of September, a group of about 40 or 50 men, known as Company 5, were being marched back from breakfast along one of the tunnels. They did not follow orders. The ranks broke. A lieutenant named Robert Curtis tried to regain control and was beaten to the ground, unconscious. In the chaos, an officer named William Quinn was struck, and then the men came up against the gate at Times Square. That gate was supposed to hold. It was the strongest point in the strongest prison in New York. But when the men pushed against it, it gave way. Not because they were strong enough to break it, and not because anyone had tampered with it. It gave way because of a defective weld, believed to date back to the prison's original construction in the early 1930s. A flaw that had been sitting inside that gate, invisible, for 40 years. They had no idea the gate was defective. Neither did the state. But when it failed, it handed them the hub of the entire prison, and with it, access to all 4 cell blocks. Within a couple of hours, a scuffle in a corridor had become something nobody in the building had planned or imagined. Prisoners held the tunnels, they held Times Square, and they held D Yard. Fires were set. Parts of the prison were wrecked, and guards and civilian employees, men who had come to work that morning expecting an ordinary Thursday, were taken hostage. One of them was William Quinn. He was 28 years old. He was married, and he was the father of 2 young daughters. He had been beaten during the takeover and had suffered a fractured skull, and he was carried out of the prison and taken to a hospital in Rochester. On Saturday, the 11th of September, William Quinn died. Remember that, because his death would become the single fact that made everything that followed impossible to stop. By the end of the first day, roughly 1,281 prisoners were gathered in D Yard, holding about 40 guards and civilian employees as hostages, with the state police massing outside the walls. And what happened next, inside that yard, is the part of the story that almost nobody expects. If you're finding this story worth your time, a like on the video genuinely helps more people find the channel. Now, let's go into D Yard. The people who went into D Yard over the next 4 days did not find what they expected. They expected a mob. They found a government. Within hours, the men in the yard had organized themselves. They elected representatives, roughly 1 from each block and company, to form a negotiating committee. They set up a medical station. They dug latrines. They organized the distribution of food and water. And most remarkably of all, they created a security force whose explicit job was to protect the hostages. The man who led that security force was named Frank Smith. Everyone called him Big Black. He was a large, physically imposing man, and the job he took on was to make sure that nothing happened to the guards and civilian employees being held in that yard, and to make sure nothing happened to the outsiders who came in to negotiate. The hostages were moved into a defined, guarded area. Some of them were given prisoners' own coats and blankets against the cold. The prison's own physician was allowed in to examine them, and the men in the yard asked for something that tells you exactly what they understood about their situation. They asked for observers, outside witnesses, people from the free world to come inside and watch, because they believed, correctly as it turned out, that what the state did to them would depend entirely on whether anyone was watching. The state agreed. And over the following days, a remarkable group of people walked into D Yard. The radical lawyer William Kunstler, the New York Times columnist Tom Wicker, the state senator John Dunn, the congressman Herman Badillo, Bobby Seale of the Black Panther Party, Clarence Jones, the publisher of the Amsterdam News, who had been an advisor to Martin Luther King. What those observers saw, and later testified to, was not a riot. It was an assembly. Men taking turns to speak, rules being followed, discipline being kept. And on the second night, under floodlights, a 21-year-old prisoner named Elliot Barkley, who everyone called LD, stood up in front of the cameras and the observers and made a speech that would outlive him. Barkley was not a hardened criminal. He was in Attica on a parole violation. He was a young man with a gift for words, and what he said in that yard has been quoted ever since. We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten or driven as such. He said the entire prison population had set forth to change forever. The ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States. He said what had happened at Attica was but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed. He was 21 years old. He would be dead in 4 days. To understand what those 4 days actually were, you have to picture the yard. D Yard is an open rectangle of concrete and dirt, surrounded on all sides by the prison. There is no roof. In September, in western New York, the nights get cold and the rain comes. More than 1,000 men lived out in that open yard for 4 days and 4 nights. They built shelters out of blankets and scrap wood and mattresses dragged from the cells. They dug trenches for latrines. They rationed the food they had taken from the commissary. They slept on the ground, in the wet, in shifts, because a large number of them stayed awake all night, every night watching the walls, waiting for the assault they were sure was coming. Tom Wicker, the New York Times columnist who went in as an observer, later wrote about what it felt like to walk into that yard as a middle-aged white journalist. He described being escorted through a corridor of men, hundreds of faces, absolute silence, and then being brought to a table under floodlights where the negotiating committee was waiting for him, organized and courteous, and realizing that everything he had assumed on the drive up was wrong. The observers were not neutral parties, and they never pretended to be. Some of them, like William Kunstler, were radical lawyers who had defended the Chicago Seven. Others, like Senator John Dunn, were Republicans. What they had in common by the end of the second day was a shared and increasingly desperate conviction that if the state went in with guns, a massacre would follow, and that everybody knew it. They were right about the massacre. They were also, and this is the tragedy inside the tragedy, running out of things to offer. Because the men in that yard, by day 3, had done the arithmetic themselves. They had seen what happened at San Quentin 3 weeks earlier. They believed, most of them, that if they walked out of D Yard without a guarantee, they would be beaten. Some of them would be killed, and nobody on the outside would ever hear about it. It was not paranoia. It is very close to what actually happened. So the negotiation was not really a negotiation about toilet paper and mail. Both sides understood by the end that it was a negotiation about whether the men in that yard would survive giving up. And the state could not give that guarantee because a corrections officer was dead. The men in D Yard produced a list, 28 demands. And here is the thing that surprises people most when they read them. The demands were not radical. They were, most of them, mundane. They asked for adequate food and clean water, better medical care, an end to the censorship of their mail, religious freedom, educational programs, a fair grievance procedure, minimum wage for their labor, the right to be treated in a way that a person on the outside would consider basic, and the state agreed to almost all of it. 28 demands went in, and the Commissioner of Corrections, Russell Oswald, accepted the overwhelming majority of them. On paper, the negotiation had worked. It came apart over 2 things. The first was the removal of the prison superintendent, Vincent Mancusi. The second, and the one that ended everything, was amnesty. The men in D Yard wanted a guarantee that they would not be prosecuted for what had happened during the takeover, and for a while, that might have been negotiable. Then, William Quinn died in the hospital in Rochester. The moment Officer Quinn died, the crime inside those walls was no longer property damage and unlawful imprisonment. It was homicide, and there was no district attorney and no governor in the United States who was going to grant blanket amnesty for a killing. The observers knew it. The negotiators knew it. The men in the yard, many of whom now believed that without amnesty, they were all going to be charged with murder and beaten half to death anyway, dug in. And so, in the last 2 days, the entire thing came down to one man. The governor of New York was Nelson Rockefeller. He was one of the most powerful men in America, an heir to one of the greatest fortunes in the world, and a man with ambitions for the presidency. The observers begged him to come to Attica, not to negotiate, not to concede anything, simply to come, to be physically present, so that the men in the yard would believe the state was taking them seriously and would have a reason to stand down. His own Commissioner of Corrections asked him to come. The Observers Committee asked him to come. Senator Dunn asked him to come. Tom Wicker asked him to come. Rockefeller refused. He never came to Attica. He stayed at his estate and authorized the retaking by telephone. And on the morning of Monday, the 13th of September, 1971, a final ultimatum was delivered into D Yard. Release the TC. Hostages. It was rejected. In the yard, prisoners brought several blindfolded hostages up onto the catwalks with makeshift knives held to them, hoping that the sight of it would stop what they could see coming. It did not stop anything. At around 9:45, the helicopter came in and the gas fell. The force that went in behind it numbered around 550 New York State police troopers, joined by criminal investigators, sheriff's deputies, park police, and Attica's own correction officers. Men whose colleagues were hostages in that yard, and who had watched their friend Bill Quinn die 2 days earlier, were permitted to take part in the assault with weapons in their hands. The weapons themselves are the reason the death toll is what it is. Most of the men were carrying shotguns loaded with double-aught buckshot. A shotgun shell like that does not fire one projectile at one target. It throws a spray of 9 or 12 heavy pellets that spread out as they travel, and in a walled concrete yard, those pellets ricochet off the ground and the walls. Others carried rifles firing unjacketed, soft-point bullets, the kind of ammunition that expands on impact, and that international convention had banned from use in warfare. In a yard packed with more than 1,000 blinded men lying on the ground, and 40 hostages lying on the ground among them, there was no such thing as an aimed shot. The shooting lasted about 6 minutes. More than 2,000 rounds were fired. The yard was in state hands within 20 minutes. 128 men were shot. 39 of them died. 29 were prisoners. 10 were hostages. 9 of those hostages died that morning, and a 10th, an officer named Harrison Whalen, died of his wounds 4 weeks later. Every single one of them, prisoner and hostage alike, was killed by the guns of the state. Not one member of the assault force was killed by a prisoner. Among the dead was Elliot Barkley, the 21-year-old who had stood up in the yard and said, "We are men. We are not beasts." He was shot in the back. To understand what those 6 minutes were actually like, you have to hold 2 facts at the same time. The first is that the men doing the shooting could not see clearly either. The yard was full of gas. It was chaos. It was loud, and they had been standing outside those walls for 4 days, listening to rumors about what was happening to their friends inside. Many of them were terrified. Some of them were enraged. A number of the men firing into that yard were Attica's own officers, who had buried a colleague 2 days earlier. The second fact is that none of that changes what buckshot does in a walled concrete space. The state sent hundreds of men with the wrong weapons into an enclosed yard full of people who were lying face down and could not run, and it did so knowing that its own hostages were in there. The McKay Commission would later find that the assault was carried out with no adequate plan for identifying hostages, no coordinated command over who was permitted to fire, and no serious control over the shooting once it began. There was no order given to stop. It simply ran out, and the men who died were not, for the most part, anybody's idea of a ringleader. The hostages who died had spent 4 days being fed and sheltered by the prisoners holding them, and then were killed by the men who came to save them. Officer John D'Arcangelo was 23 years old. Officer Herbert Jones was 26. Elmer Hardy was 57. Elon Werner was 64 years old, a civilian employee who worked in the prison, an old man who had come to work on a Thursday and never went home. On the prisoner side, the youngest of the dead was a teenager. The oldest was in his 50s, and among them was Elliot Barkley, shot in the back at 21, 4 days after standing in front of a television camera and saying, "We are men. We are not beasts." When it was over, the state had killed 10 of the 40 people it had gone in to rescue, and then, within hours, came the lie. That afternoon, state corrections officials told the assembled press that the hostages had been found with their throats slashed by the prisoners, and that one of them had been mutilated. The story went out on the wire services. It went around the world. The next morning, it was on the front page of newspapers across America, and it did exactly what such a story does. It told the country that the men in that yard had been animals, and that the state had done the only thing it could. It was false. The autopsies were performed in Rochester by the Monroe County Medical Examiner, Dr. John Edlund. He did the work under enormous pressure, with state police present in his morgue, and within about 24 hours he stood up and told the truth. Every one of the dead hostages had died of gunshot wounds. There were no cut throats. There was no mutilation. The prisoners in D Yard had never had a single firearm. For telling the truth, Dr. John Edlund was called a liar. He was accused of being a radical and a communist. His family received threats. He would say later that he had no idea, when he began those autopsies, what it would cost him. A second, independent panel of pathologists was brought in, and it confirmed everything he had found. The state's own investigating commission would later find that officials had allowed the false story to stand for far longer than they should have, and called the delay in correcting it unconscionable. The killing stopped at about 10 in the morning. What happened next is the part that the state fought hardest to keep out of the public record. The prisoners who had survived were stripped, made to crawl through mud, and forced to run between lines of officers who beat them as they passed. Men with gunshot wounds were beaten. Frank Smith, Big Black, the man who had spent 4 days protecting the hostages from harm, was singled out. He was stripped naked, laid on a table in the yard with a football wedged under his chin, and told that if it dropped, he would be killed. He was left there for hours while officers burned him with cigarettes and beat him and told him what they were going to do to him. This is not an allegation from one side. The reprisals were documented by the state's own investigating commission and established again decades later in federal court. That commission, chaired by a law school dean named Robert McKay, produced a report in 1972 that remains one of the most damning documents any American state has ever written about itself, and it contained a sentence that has followed Attica ever since. The commission wrote that, with the exception of the Indian massacres in the late 19th century, the state police assault which ended the 4-day prison uprising was the bloodiest one-day encounter between Americans since the Civil War, and then came the prosecutions. 62 prisoners were indicted, facing more than 1,000 counts between them. The number of state troopers or correction officers indicted for the shooting of 39 men and for the beatings that followed was, for all practical purposes, none. One officer was eventually indicted, and that case did not result in a conviction. It took until 1976 for a governor, Hugh Carey, to end it. He closed the book on the Attica prosecutions, granting clemency and pardons, saying the state needed to close the book on this most tragic chapter. What that meant in practice was that no one, on either side, would face a full accounting. The civil cases lasted decades. In the year 2000, the surviving prisoners and the families of those killed finally received a settlement of $8 million, split among more than 1,000 men, which came to a few $1,000s each after nearly 30 years of litigation. But there is another set of victims in this story, and for a long time, they were the most forgotten of all. The families of the dead hostages, the widows and children of the officers and civilian employees killed by state gunfire, were told in the days after the assault that inmates had murdered their husbands and fathers. And then, in the weeks that followed, many of them were handed workers' compensation checks. What they were not clearly told was that in cashing those checks, they were signing away their right to ever sue the state of New York. It took those families until 2005, 34 years, to receive a settlement of $12 million. Some of the widows were by then old women. Some had died waiting. And there is one more piece of this that is worth understanding, because it explains why Attica stayed unresolved for half a century. The state of New York investigated itself, and then it did not like the answer. A special prosecutor's office was set up to look at what happened, and it was, at least at first, genuinely trying. Investigators inside that office began finding evidence of what the troopers had done, and of how the crime scene had been handled afterward. Weapons had not been properly logged. The yard had been cleaned up before it could be examined, the way a scene with 39 dead bodies should be examined. Men who had fired had not been individually identified. One of the prosecutors, a man named Malcolm Bell, eventually concluded that his own office was not pursuing the state police with anything like the energy it was pursuing the prisoners, and he said so publicly. He wrote a report. He went to the press. He was, in the way of these things, treated as the problem. And so you end up with the arithmetic that defines Attica. On one side, 62 prisoners indicted on more than 1,000 counts, prosecuted for years, in a case built substantially on the testimony of other prisoners. On the other side, 39 men shot dead by state gunfire, dozens more beaten afterward, and essentially, no one held to account for any of it. When Governor Hugh Carey closed the book in 1976, he was not doing it out of mercy. He was doing it because the cases against the state were becoming as dangerous to New York as the cases against the prisoners. Ending both at once was the only exit that protected everyone in Albany. It was called healing. In practice, it meant that the last chance for an accounting was closed by the same institution that needed it closed. That is the thing about Attica that people miss when they turn it into a political argument. The state's bullets did not check anyone's uniform. The men who died in that yard were prisoners and guards together, and the families on both sides spent the next 3 decades being lied to by the same government. 4 years later, a film came out that would put the name of this prison into the mouths of people who knew nothing about it. Dog Day Afternoon was released in 1975, directed by Sidney Lumet, with Al Pacino in the lead. It is based on a true story, but not this one. It tells the story of a chaotic bank robbery in Brooklyn in 1972, in which a desperate man named John Wojtowicz took hostages and ended up in a long standoff with the police, surrounded by a crowd. And in the most famous scene in the film, Pacino's character walks out into the street in front of the police who have their guns trained on him, and he starts shouting one word over and over at the cops. And the crowd behind the barricades starts shouting it with him. Attica, Attica, Attica. He is not talking about a bank. He is reminding a street full of New Yorkers, 4 years after the fact, what happens when American police open fire on people they have surrounded, and the crowd knows exactly what he means. That is how raw it still was in 1975. That scene did something strange. It made the word Attica immortal, and at the same time, it slowly detached it from the thing it described. For a generation of people, Attica became a movie moment, a piece of film history, a thing Al Pacino yells. The 43 human beings who died to make that word mean something faded behind it. John Lennon wrote a song about it. In 2021, the filmmaker Stanley Nelson released a documentary called Attica that was nominated for an Academy Award and put the surviving witnesses on camera at last. And in 2016, the historian Heather Ann Thompson published Blood in the Water, a book built out of documents the state had kept sealed for decades. It won the Pulitzer Prize. Even then, and this is worth sitting with, many Attica records remained sealed. Half a century after the fact, the state of New York was still fighting to keep parts of this story in the dark. Before we leave the aftermath, it is worth staying with a few of the people, because Attica is usually told as a set of numbers and a political fight, and the numbers were human beings who had to keep waking up afterward. Frank Smith, Big Black, went back to a cell. The man who had organized the security detail to keep the hostages alive, who had personally made sure that guards were fed and sheltered, spent hours naked on a table in the yard with a football under his chin, being told he was about to be killed, and then went on serving his sentence. He was released years later. And he did something that almost nobody does. He spent the rest of his life on the Attica case, working with the lawyers, tracking down survivors, testifying, refusing to let it be buried. When the settlement finally came in the year 2000, he was one of the men who had made it happen. He died 4 years after that. Dr. John Edlund, the medical examiner, never fully escaped what he had done. He told the truth in 24 hours, under pressure, with state police standing in his morgue, and for it he was called a communist and a liar, and his family was threatened. His findings were confirmed by an independent panel almost immediately, and the confirmation got a fraction of the coverage the accusation had. He kept working. He died in 1999. And then, there are the families of the officers. Imagine being told on a Monday that your husband, who went to work as a prison guard, had his throat cut by inmates. Imagine going to his funeral believing that. Imagine the men from the state coming to your house in the weeks afterward, while you have small children and no income, and handing you a compensation check, and imagine signing for it because you have to eat. And then imagine finding out, sometimes years later, that the story you had been told was false, that your husband had been shot by the state of New York, and that the piece of paper you signed when you cashed that check had quietly extinguished your right to ever sue anyone about it. That happened to a number of those families. It is one of the coldest things in this entire story, and it is not disputed. It took until 2005, 34 years, for the state to settle with them for $12 million. Some of the widows were dead by then. The children who had been small in 1971 were in their 40s. Dee Quinn Miller, the daughter of William Quinn, the first officer to die, was a small child when her father was killed. She grew up and spent much of her adult life campaigning, alongside the other families, for the truth about what the state had done and for the records to be opened. And in one of the strangest and most human turns in this whole history, the families of the officers and the surviving prisoners, who had been set against each other for decades by the politics of it, eventually found that they were asking the state for exactly the same thing. Attica Correctional Facility never closed. It is still there, in that same village in Wyoming County, still a maximum security prison, still holding men behind that same 30-foot wall. The gun towers still stand. Trucks still come and go through the gate. If you drive out of Buffalo into the farmland, you will come over a rise and see it sitting in the fields, enormous and gray, exactly where it has been since 1931. D-Yard is still a yard. Men still walk in it. Every September, small groups gather to remember. For decades, there were really two commemorations, and they did not speak to each other. The families of the correction officers who died gathered to remember their men. The former prisoners and their supporters gathered to remember theirs. Both groups were remembering people killed by the same guns, on the same morning, on the same patch of ground, and for a very long time, the politics of it kept them apart. Some of that has softened with time, as the survivors have grown old and died. There is a memorial to the officers. There has been a long and difficult argument about how and whether to memorialize the prisoners. It is still not fully settled, and the men who were there are almost all gone now. Frank Smith, Big Black, spent the rest of his life fighting the Attica case and died in 2004, 4 years after the settlement. Elliot Barkley, the young man who said, "We are men, we are not beasts," never turned 22. Here is what stays with you about Attica. Once you strip away the politics that have been fought over its bones for 50 years, everything that made it a catastrophe was ordinary. The gate that opened the prison was not blown open by a plan. It failed because of a bad weld that a workman had left behind 40 years earlier, and nobody on either side of the bars knew it was there. The uprising did not begin with a manifesto. It began with a scuffle in a corridor after breakfast. The demands the men made were not revolutionary. They asked for toilet paper, and clean water, and doctors, and the right to read, their own mail. And the thing that turned all of that into 39 bodies in a yard was not some grand act of evil either. It was a governor who would not drive 4 hours to a prison. It was a decision to send hundreds of men with shotguns into a crowd of 1,000 people who could not see. It was buckshot in a concrete box. Attica was supposed to be the answer to everything. The most modern prison in America, escape-proof, riot-proof, a paradise for convicts, the newspaper said in 1931. And what it actually produced, 4 decades later, was the bloodiest single day between Americans since the Civil War, and a lie about slashed throats that circled the globe before the truth had finished its first autopsy. The prisoners in that yard understood something the state did not want them to say out loud, and a 21-year-old kid said it into a microphone under the floodlights with 4 days left to live. We are men. We are not beasts. 4 days later, the state shot him in the back and told the country he was an animal, and it took a doctor with a scalpel and a spine to prove otherwise. The wall is still standing out there in the fields tonight. So is the yard, and the state of New York is still, half a century on, holding some of the paper. If this is the kind of story you think more people should hear, go back through the channel. There are dozens more like it. The prisons and the asylums and the forgotten institutions America built and then tried not to think about. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one.